What is up, fellas sickos? I am Dan Valley coming at you with a very brief introduction. I went on the Drop Step NBA podcast with Jack Quantrill. Go check him out, subscribe to his stuff. I'll include links to his Twitter handle and the podcast itself in the YouTube and podcast description. Go give them some reviews. They don't have any reviews yet on their shows. I believe I saw on Apple Podcast. So do them a solid, does really good work over there. Asks a lot of interesting questions. He had me on to talk about NBA players who need a change of scenery ahead of the deadline. He will get into the criteria we set out, but it was to avoid us just talking, oh, Jimmy Butler needs to go, Zach LaVine needs to go. So we set a different sort of criteria for it. Very interesting discussion. Had a bunch of very interesting names and teams come up, so I think you'll enjoy it. Let me know what you think of it. And if you have not already and you're just checking us out for the first time for some reason, hit that subscribe button on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Like, comment, help the algo love us back. Join our Discord to come hang out with us, especially as it gets around trade. Well, we're in trade season, but especially as we get closer to the trade deadline. A lot of fun stuff and fun discussions happening. With that, though, let's talk to Jack Quantrill, the Drop Step NBA podcast about, well, I guess I should say, allow Jack Quantrill of the Drop Step NBA podcast to talk to me about NBA players we think need a change of scenery.
Hello and welcome back to the Drop Step podcast. I say Drop Step podcast. It's a bit of a HardwoodKnocks crossover episode because I'm joined by the one, the only Dan Favali. Dan, you put out podcasts and videos at a rate of knots, but I'm assuming I've caught you for your first podcast of 2025. How are you feeling, man? You excited to kick off the new year on the Drop Step feed?
Yeah, I'm super excited. And you did catch me. We did have a podcast go live to open 2025, but we recorded it in 2024. It was on
There you
December
go.
1st. So this is my first on camera podcast work of 2025. So I'm stoked to pick up where I left off and keep disseminating these awful takes.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's get it down in the record books. It's a big one today. But we are talking about, some teams or some players might have New Year's resolutions, but what we're talking about is kind of in the spirit of that. It's players that might need a change of scenery. So I was inspired to suggest this episode to Dan when I watched his trade deadline big board episode. I'd recommend you guys all go and check that out because that was a fun couple of hours. But I thought there are some players. Yeah, it was a couple of hours, Dan. It was good. It kept me entertained. I was wrapping presents and everything. It was great. But I would say that there are some players that aren't necessarily in the trade rumor mill at the moment that I look at. And to me, I think they really might need that change of scenery. If they were to get it, maybe we'd view them in a new light. Or, maybe there were players that you mentioned in that episode, Dan, where I look at Zach LaVine, for example, who I think was maybe number one in that video for you. And I think, yeah, he might be on the trade block, but he doesn't need a change of scenery. He's doing perfectly well in Chicago. He's putting up great numbers at the moment. So we're kind of tackling like a similar topic, but I'm excited for it. And how did you interpret this? When I said change of scenery, did you go for guys that are strictly like in the rumor mill, or did you look and go, I can see a diamond in the rough. It's just he's buried at the end of a certain team's rotation?
It was a mix because there are certain guys in the rumor mill that I think absolutely belong in that discussion.
Yeah.
But you also I figured there might be overlap, so I'd have contingencies too. But they're also just it's more fun to think about guys that aren't, maybe they've been mentioned in trade speculation, but they're not actively in these rumors, to think, could they shoulder a bigger role, or what would they look like on other teams? So my list is probably will end up being predominantly populated by, okay, there might be the one or two names of we were expecting this, but it's predominantly probably populated by maybe some people started thinking about this, but it's not necessarily just out there and being discussed at the moment.
Good. I've sort of tried to incorporate a couple of players that I think could really sort of elevate in a new scenario, but I do have some like trade rumor mill favorites. And one guy that you spoke about on your podcast video, it goes out on so many channels these days, Dan, was Brandon Ingram. And I think that of all the players that are on the rumor mill at the moment, he's the one that has probably reached the end of his tenure with the New Orleans Pelicans, obviously having no struggles renegotiating his extension with the Pelicans. And I feel like the team fit isn't there anymore. We had this sort of like piece of slop, if you're going by ball terms, drop. And it's that the only three players that are untradeable in the New Orleans Pelicans franchise at the moment are Herb Jones, Trey Murphy III, and Yves Missi. And two of those three players play in the position that Brandon Ingram plays. So you sort of read between the lines. And I think that he absolutely needs to get out of New Orleans. Was he a name that had crossed your mind, or were you trying to just sort of say, I've spoken about Brandon Ingram for 6 months, maybe we'll look for someone else?
No, he's on there. It is interesting though because I started to wonder if is it that New Orleans needs him to change teams more than he needs to change teams because I look at it from
Sure.
Brandon Ingram's perspective and you're right about the fit. It's been iffy for a few years and
Hmm.
they convoluted it even well in theory they convoluted it even more if they were going to be at full strength, which apparently they're never going to be because even Brandon Ingram himself is injured at the moment.
Yep.
Uh, the fit's gotten bad, progressively worse, I'd probably argue, or at least it's the same. And we've always kind of known they need someone who they always viewed Brandon Ingram as just him and Zion operated on such different wavelengths. It never made sense to me. And if he wasn't going to be someone who could run a bunch of two-man stuff with Zion or be the off-ball, high-volume three-point shooter, you always kind of wondered why weren't they shopping him sooner? And it was because they were hedging against what they're dealing with now, where it felt like they were building their team in the image of Zion is our tent pole, but we need to be able to exist without him. And that's
Yeah.
like the territory that Brandon Ingram occupied. Which I think was just flawed because I think it led to a bunch of just half measure type moves or three-quarter measure moves. And it's put it in a weird situation where, okay, well, now he's in a contract year. It might like he's a better fit on different teams if they want to build around him or just make him a clear cut on ball number two or something along those lines. But I'm also just looking at New Orleans and are you to lose him for nothing in free agent? Like I'm curious as to because if they don't trade him, they're gonna pay him something. And so he's gonna
Mm.
get paid no matter what. So it's mutual where I think both of these both of these parties just need to move on. It's interesting that you picked Brandon Ingram though, because I picked his teammate as one of my guys, and Zion Williamson, I think, needs a change
Good.
this year.
Let's tie this together. Give me the Zion pitch because we haven't been able to see that, it hasn't worked on court this year because I think he's only played sort of like 5 or 6 games so far. It's been tantalizing when he's been on the floor, but that's like the story of his career so far, right?
Yeah, and I think you could, if I'm New Orleans, I've seen people just more like, should you trade Zion for expiring contracts or should you just waive him if you can get out of it because of the non-guarantees on it? I'm
Mm.
not to that degree for them. Like I'm holding on to Zion Williamson unless someone's giving me something. But just looking at it, could he go somewhere else? Will they handle like his body any differently? Or I think this is the actual perspective I view it from. It's just time. Like this hasn't worked out. Go somewhere else, or maybe they view you as this accessory, a number two or another number three. Maybe they're not putting the ball in your hands as much, but they're going to have you set more screens. And there are,
Hmm.
at least two players who are better than you on the roster, or at least let's say even one player who's better and more important than you on the roster. And if I'm there, I don't know if you read the ESPN piece that came out. I don't know if it was January 1st or December 31st from Bobby Marks and Tim McMahon, I believe,
Mm.
but where there was the one leak source that quoted, if I ran a team, I would do something stupid to get Zion Williamson. And I'm absolutely in that camp because in all likelihood, it won't pan out. But to get a shot at someone who when he is healthy, forever long he is healthy, that he is one of the top 15 players in the NBA, that's a really big deal. And then to get that player at the nadir probably of his value to where
Yep.
I think if you set the over under on the number of first round picks or equivalent at 1.5 that the Pelicans get for Zion Williamson, most people are taking the under on that.
Yeah.
And so if it's going to cost me a first round pick, I'm just doing it. And so it just feels like it's time. And also, this is long winded. Could we just get him on a team with better spacing? That's something New Orleans has never really given him. And that's the other thing I want to see is for however many games he plays, let's see him next to at least three, but preferably four shooters at all times.
Yeah. So I think I want to touch on both of those points because to me, Zion is one of the best two-level scorers in the league, and you can almost reduce that down to 1.5. And my thought had always been, yeah, he's incredible in that 1.5 zone, sort of like 12 feet and in, basically. But he doesn't really threaten from beyond the line. He can sometimes, like, start his dribble, start his pick and roll, like beyond the 3-point line. But I think from a team point of view, I would love to see him with players that pose that insane threat from three and like from deep three as well. So there'll be another player that we talk about in due course. But, say Zion got to Charlotte and you pair him with Brandon Miller and you pair him with LaMelo Ball, two players who I think are currently averaging the most 3-point attempts as an NBA duo in NBA history at the moment. But two players that also kind of struggle with that rim creation, struggle to get to the hoop. And it's almost like you fix both of their problems for them, where, like you said, Dan, with this Brandon Ingram in the mix, there's always just been that like, the spacing's a little bit cramped. Yeah, Jonas Valanciunas can kind of space, Larry Nance can kind of space,
Right.
but he's never dealt in sort of ideal conditions. And with that, neither is Brandon Ingram. I think you look at Brandon and you probably say, I quite like a spaced set floor, and I'd like you to run 25, 30 pick and rolls a game. And unless you have Zion as the roller, you're going to have someone that you can really help off, or you're going to have someone that, yeah, you might allow Zion to build a head of steam, but it's going to cramp that paint and it's going to force your offense one way. And I think that if Zion were to get moved at the moment, the trade it would remind me of the most, if things worked out really well, is like the Kyrie Irving to Dallas trade. When you speak
Okay.
about getting someone at the nadir of their value.
Right. That's just
Sorry.
it's interesting because so we know Zion can ball and we knew Kyrie could ball even if he was going through that stuff. It's just he's never been healthy enough. And so it's if he does go somewhere else and end up playing more, it'll be fascinating to see, well, did something else happen behind the scenes? Was it a change in mindset or approach from him, from the team, or did this team just get super lucky and had New Orleans held on to him? And that's why you don't trade Zion Williamson too, by the way, is, well, what if he just goes somewhere, is healthier for the next 2 to 3 years and contributes to being the second or even third best player on a contender? But I'm at the point for it's exhausting. It's New Orleans really just needs to hit the reset button. And so that's another, I think, vote in favor of kind of, if you can get a first round pick for Zion, then go ahead and you're not taking on any really bad money. Just go ahead and do it. Like, let's rip off this Band-Aid already.
And they actually have the capital, and they obviously have the standing in the NBA this year in the Western Conference to do so, because they're going to be getting a guy that you could potentially sell to the franchise as, or fan base rather, as a franchise guy going forward. You know, if they are 1, 2, 3 in this 2025 draft, suddenly you can say, hey, we've got Cooper Flag. Who needs Zion Williamson? We've got Dylan Harper, and you've got this long extended runway. But that could also be a little bit of a cause of like, oh, we've got this other young star that we could pair with Zion. We can move on from Brandon. He's on the rookie contract scale, so our salary doesn't have to get like too insane, which is something that the Pelicans always try to avoid. He's the player for me where I think if you trade him or you don't, it kind of just gets you fired. Because if you trade him, it's an admission that you did the wrong thing and you've mismanaged this entire situation. Like you said, he probably could have got a lot more for him around the 2023 draft, where he was sort of being spoken about as like you could trade Zion for the number 2 or the number 3 pick.
Mm-hmm.
And if you trade him and he goes to a team sort of a la Kyrie Irving and he contributes to a conference finals run, a finals run, a championship, you know you'll get him fired then, because it's just going to be, we gave up that guy for what? So I don't know. Is there anywhere around the league where you'd like to see him?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. The Warriors have been mentioned. They would be fun. You mentioned Charlotte. I think that could be pretty fun. Ideally, he would end up on like in OKC with some 5-out lineups, but that's not feasible when you like, and they don't need him.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly, Golden State's the one that intrigues me the most, is kind of him around Steph Curry. And then you have Draymond there, who's not really a spacer, but you do have some requisite shooting. I wouldn't hate him. No, I probably would hate him there. I was going to say Houston, but I don't really love it. You know what team would be really fun, but to get to the money is a struggle right now? The Clippers would be insanely
Okay.
fun.
That I would be so worried about that. It's just sort of cursed franchise after cursed franchise. If he gets to LA, it's like, hey, we're moving on from Kawhi Leonard. We're going to get in a star that you can rely on. Zion Williamson. It'd definitely be an interesting one. I think that they can make the money work. I think that the Dallas Mavericks could make the money work. It's just one of those where it's like, are you going to be that team that sacrifices the depth, goes out and forms a big 3? And if you already have this floor of like Luka and Kyrie, do you want to sacrifice that floor for like the ceiling of, you've seen what this team can do in the NBA finals? Maybe they can't get over the hump against the elite of the elite in the NBA. That's something that could just about work, because Zion, unlike a Jimmy Butler, who's another player that's been linked to Dallas, he's on $37 million this year. And you can make it work without it completely wrecking the depth on that roster. So that's the other team. But I like the Golden State shout as well, was sort of like, Andrew Wiggins brought a ton of value to them as a rebounder during their finals run as well. So someone to bring a little bit more physicality to like an old school duo of Steph and Draymond could be interesting.
Yeah, if only Zion rebounded better, that would actually probably make a lot more sense too. He's like a tough fit which is also why it gets really interesting. You can't just like throw a team out there. I thought about the Spurs for a minute too, just because if
Yeah.
Wemby is considered a floor spacer, then like you can play another big man type who's not so much of a floor spacer. And if it's really only going to cost you a pick, and for the Spurs, it's like, all right, well, Harrison Barnes, Zach Collins, Keldon Johnson, we'll send you two of those guys.
Yeah.
Picks maybe one of the Flyers on like one of the lower level youngsters. That would be an interesting spot. I don't love this functionally, but like Toronto just trying shit, like hashtag let's just try it and see what happens. And I think you could even make a case just with where they're at in their development. Washington could be somewhat fascinating, but I don't
Yeah.
trust. Yeah, that's another cursed franchise. So like you said, you might want to keep him away from there.
We spoke pre-pod, and I said that I did a Utah Jazz podcast that I really enjoyed, and that's the kind of move that I'd maybe like to see, because
Oh
they're a
yeah.
team with sort of like funky spacing, and they could just say this year, oh, Zion's out for the season, go and get that top draft pick, and then you maybe really launch at the 25-26 season, having traded for a star at the nadir of his value.
Honestly, you know what team would be really fascinating? Brooklyn, because Jordy Fernandez is an offensive wizard. I mean, like they've had to trade dudes to get worse on offense. Like that's how Cam Thomas got injured. And with just Dennis Schroeder basically running the show, they were still like top 10 and half court efficiency. So you throw Zion there. He's not ruining your tank this season because by that, like he's probably not going to play enough. And then you want to tank again next year. You're not going to be good enough with Zion and whoever you draft to not get a really high draft pick. And then it's okay. Now we got two really high draft picks around Zion. Maybe we've slow played it this half season and then next full season. And then we've now built something there. And so to see him under that type of offensive creativity, I would love that. That wasn't a team that immediately sprang to mind, but that might be my favorite potential destination would be Brooklyn. I just don't know, what are they giving up at the stage of their development? Are they going to throw a Knicks pick or a Phoenix pick towards, I'm not throwing a Phoenix. Actually, do they even own any more Phoenix pick?
I
I
think
would
they
consider
moved
throwing a
to
Knicks
Houston,
pick.
didn't they? Yeah.
I'd probably consider throwing it, or a Dallas pick. That's like so far in the distance. I would consider it though, just to take a flyer on Zion. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, exactly. Like, imagine if Ben Simmons could score. That'd be the scenario, because they've made Ben work on the court this year, and he's an expiring contract. So New Orleans again can get off that money. You just attach pick capital there. Maybe they're interested in Cam Thomas. Who knows? It's a scenario that could maybe work. I think what we figured out in the first like 15 minutes of this podcast is Zion Williamson still very much has a potential market. And we're speaking about him as that like 1.5 picks over under. I'm starting to lean more over, because we're talking about a lot of interesting scenarios for him. So let's see, Dan, have you got one more team for us?
For a Zion fit, or like
I heard an ooh. Do you want to go player? Should we move on from Zion?
Yeah, I was saying when you said the over 1.5 draft picks, I am the GM that would give it up too. They're not going to be like great draft picks, but I would absolutely do it. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, in a heartbeat. I'd much rather Zion Williamson than two guys in their 20s, and obviously we'd be the GMs that do that trade and then suddenly suffer the Brooklyn Nets like fall from grace, and then you're giving up a Jaylen Brown. But
what
that's
about
why
Atlanta?
we're in the chairs at the moment.
Because you could play him with Jalen Johnson. That's a small front court though.
Yeah.
But you're definitely placing him off the ball with Trae Young, but that's someone that he's going to have to screen for. And then like you could run dual big pick and rolls with him and Jalen.
Yeah.
The defense would probably be toast though. You'd be kind of hard pressed. There are a handful of teams that I would like. You throw him on Denver would be really fun, but I don't really know what that does for them. He's just so fun. So if he's gonna play, you could talk me into basically any team. Just if it's gonna cost 1 or 2, whatever first round pick, you probably talk me into like any team acquiring him. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, I think so. And there'll be franchises around the league that just say, I don't want anything to do with that guy, but hopefully it works out and it makes at least someone look stupid, whether that be us or, the GM that lets him go. Poor old David Griffin, if it ever gets to that. But Dan, can you hit us with another player that you want to talk about?
So I think I'm going to just tackle this from a group perspective because I can't settle on one. We got to start trading some Kings guys. And I'm going to say, I was initially thinking Keegan Murray because they've marginalized him so much on the offensive end. But I think realistically speaking, you need to figure out a way to open up more opportunities on offense for Keegan Murray. And that's going to come by way of trade Malik Monk already. You've seen you have DeMar or trade DeMar DeRozan then. That was there. It's not that those two need to be mutually exclusive. But even Malik, we've seen a huge dip in Keegan Murray's true usage, which just calculates everything he does on the offensive end, playmaking, shot attempts, the whole nine. We've also seen a huge drop from Malik Monk because you've added someone who is so ball dominant into DeMar DeRozan, and you have De'Aaron Fox at the peak of his powers, and you have Domas Sabonis. So I would argue that you need to trade DeMar DeRozan or Malik Monk to like really optimize this team and unlock some of the players that are already in there. I know Fox is the one who's in the rumor mill. I don't think he's playing pretty well this season. Like he's going to contend for an all NBA spot as of right now. He doesn't need a change of scenery, and they would pay him. I think the Kings have created this team where they've effectively kind of marginalized everybody except De'Aaron Fox, which is he's the last person that should be marginalized. But you overcompensated, I think, with the DeRozan acquisition. So I would say Malik Monk or DeRozan. And the bigger one for me, I held out hope for a little bit, but we're 2 games, I believe, into the Doug Christie tenure as we're recording this. And he's played a total of 33 minutes in those 2 games. Get Keon Ellis out of there. If they're not going to play him and use him properly, just put him somewhere else. I don't know what the concern is at this point. Is he technically too small for you? Does he not give you the 3-point volume? Fine, whatever. I think that's dumb, but he needs to be on a new team. If he's going to be, even forget, I think he played 20 minutes in their last game. Even forget, I'd like to see that ratcheted up by at least 5 to 7 minutes. The inconsistency of just like his playing time kind of swinging from game to game, it's inexcusable. And now I think you can say that it's spanning 2 coaching tenures. So it might be a little bit early into the Doug Christie experience to say that, but I thought part of the reason they wanted to get rid of Mike Brown was they thought their roster wasn't being managed properly, but I guess it all just comes down to the crunch time record. So free Keon Ellis. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me just based off the contract he's on and the team control you have if they got a 1st-round pick for him. So I don't think they should trade him. I think they should play him, but they're not playing him enough. So he needs a change of scenery.
Couple of things. Malik Monk was the number 2 player on my list. So great minds think alike. Dan, absolutely same thinking there, where it's just you've got DeMar in, and I figured like I'd be surprised if they moved DeMar given what they gave up in the summer, given it's only been a couple of months. And it's like if another team was truly interested, they would be in the team to pay the Bulls or like try and swing that sign and trade for him in the summer. So I think that you're committed to DeMar one way or another. And with him on the team, you just have such a clear, like we should stagger the usage between Fox in the starting minutes. DeMar carries your second units and like overlaps with Fox a little bit. And that completely gets rid of the function of the 6th man of the year last year, where it was like Malik Monk was setting bench units on fire. He was absolutely fantastic when he got to play against these second units. He got to show that he could be far more of a playmaker than we ever thought. Like, I think he's got a fantastic array of pick and roll passing. When he actually gets the chance, he's a great shooter. He's a guy that can play next to stars. He's a guy that can play in starting units. But at the moment, it's just like, it's such a 2K lineup that Sacramento are running right now, where it's like, oh, we've got De'Aaron Fox, Malik Monk, and DeMar DeRozan. And then like, oh yeah, this guy that can space from the corner and Keegan Murray. It's a little bit fanciful, and I'm absolutely with you. I wouldn't have said Keon Ellis just because he needs to play for that team if it's going to work. And Kevin Huerter was someone that I wanted to see traded before the season even started because it already looked crowded at the shooting guard. And I don't know what deal he has there, but he keeps sort of getting starting minutes or like big rotation minutes. So something needs to change in Sacramento, ideally before they move on from De'Aaron Fox.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think the Aaron Fox situation is fait accompli. I'd be a little bit surprised if he gets traded by the deadline unless he asks for out, but it's over. You've kind of tipped your hand as a franchise again that you don't really know what you're doing. And this isn't to say that Mike Brown was the answer, but your lack of alternatives and just the way you handle this entire process from his extension to the roster construction of all, knowing even if you liked the DeMar DeRozan acquisition, where both my co-hosts and I, we were skeptical, but it was, oh, for what you gave up, you might as well try it. But then to still come into the season with some of the other same weaknesses and question marks around them. And just to reinforce both of our points here. So looking at the true usage, like biggest declines this year, of the 398 players, as we're recording this, who have logged at least 500 minutes, the Kings have 4 players in the top 50 of true usage declines. And they have 2 in the top 20 being DeMar DeRozan and Malik Monk. And the other 2 are Keegan Murray and then Kevin Huerter's in there. And it probably benefits Kevin Huerter, I'm not going to lie, to have a slightly smaller role just because the type of shots that they acquired him for, he all of a sudden started hitting. But
Mhm.
like, you don't want to, sometimes smaller roles are like the way that what Dallas has done with a healthy Luka this year, moving him off the ball a little bit more, someone who's that high usage. But when we're talking kind of, these aren't top tier guys. I mean, DeMar, okay, fine. His usage is coming down. He was high usage, but Malik Monk and Keegan Murray specifically, like those weren't really players that should have had room to be marginalized. So, and Keegan Murray specifically is just, I understand he wasn't a big creator, but the whole point is to continue developing him. And you've now put
Yeah.
yourself in a situation where you've, to me, pigeonholed him on the offensive end. So I don't think he needs a change of scenery because he's developed into a hell of defender there, but there needs to be players around him who need a change of scenery so that he can get proper scenery. I don't really know, that's poor phrasing, but that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I mean, like, not only have you pigeonholed him on the offensive end, it's really on the defensive end where last year you were asking him to take every single primary matchup. Go guard Luca, go guard Jason Tatum, go guard whoever you want to pick, whichever star it was that the Sacramento Kings were playing. It was probably going to be Keegan's job. And now that Harrison Barnes is out of there, they're also like, could you kind of be our secondary rebounder as well? I know that you're taking on all of these star matchups, but we also need you to help out Domas on the glass because DeMar isn't going to attack with the same ferocity that Harrison Barnes might have, once upon a time. So he's got through so much defensive usage that even if he had the energy, like even if he had the space within the offense to do it, I really wonder if he'd have the energy to like get into his hezzy game, isolate
Yeah.
at the top of the key, whatever it is that you want to see Keegan, because the poor guy is just being run into the ground on the defensive end.
And that's a great point because this was the case last year and it's the case again this year. He's second on the team in rim contests per 75 possessions. Like only don't because Sabonis is a center. Otherwise, if honestly, if the Kings had their druthers, they would probably have Keegan Murray lead them in that category just based off their personnel. So you're right. He's overstretched on that end, which makes it more blasphemous, by the way. He's clearly not going to pitch in on the glass or as the, help side, like basket protector. Like Keon Ellis is a great defender, can take on many of the perimeter assignments that Keegan Murray is forced to cover. And to me, that makes I think of all the players we mentioned, what's most inexplicable is this team's view of Keon Ellis to me. I think is because at least you come up with excuses for, well, if they don't make the DeMar move, there's no trickle down effect for Malik Monk. There's not as dramatic of a, true usage decline for Keegan Murray. But like, because they're just not like Keon Ellis shouldn't be impacted by, I guess, like you said, there's the glut of guards. He really shouldn't be impacted by any of that. Like he's plug and play on the offensive end. You don't need to guarantee him touches or shots. And so I still find his situation, if I had to pick one player from that team that needs a change of scenery, and especially because we're tackling this from the player perspective, I think it's Keon Ellis.
Yeah, and obviously Keon hasn't played a ton for the Kings. I think he saw a lot more usage towards the end, or like a lot more minutes on the court towards the end of that second season for him in Sacramento last year. But his true shooting percentage year on year has gone 63%. 63%. And then this year, we're talking about why isn't he playing? Maybe it's a shooting slump. Maybe he can't shoot the ball from the corners anymore. No, it's 66% true shooting for Keon Ellis this year. So not only could he be your defensive guy, but he is the perfect player where you could just say to De'Aaron Fox, go and run your 40 pick and rolls. DeMar DeRozan, go and isolate to your heart's content because we have a guy on the court that does not need any sort of like creation rep or anything along those lines. You can just rely on him to do his job. So yeah, it's a little bit baffling as it stands. I think you're right. I think that they could probably pull a first round pick. The only team that seems to like have a glut of these Keon Ellis style players is the Memphis Grizzlies, where they've got like Scottie Pippen Jr., Jay Huff, Jalen Wells. I know that's just a second round pick, but GG Jackson as well signed to these incredible second round pick Deuce McBride style deals. But yeah, Keon would just be useful anywhere. He's like one of the few players that even the Phoenix Suns could trade for.
Yeah. And honestly, they could probably, he's like a little bit on the tinier end, but they could use him. I even thought because I believe they could trade this year's pick, I'd have to double check that. Like, would Boston just give you 2 firsts for him? Because doesn't Keon have another year of cost control, or am I misremembering on that? I should probably double check. But like, if he has another year of team control and you're a really good team, maybe your 2 first round picks is probably a stretch, but like you give up 1 without even thinking about it, just because you're already expensive. And so you want someone who's playable. And yeah, he has another year left on his deal after this one at 2.3
And
million. So these teams that are in the second apron,
yeah,
and maybe if you have multiple picks, yes, you protect the hell out of the second one, but it wouldn't shock me. It would not shock me. It's probably too ambitious. And by the way, the Kings would be complicit if you don't think his trade value is where it should be, because had he maybe played more, it'd be easier for teams to justify giving up a first round pick or more. I think, to be clear, I think 2 first round picks is overkill, but like,
yeah,
if I'm just a team that's good and somehow has like the Magic as an example, just
yeah.
their own first round pick's not going to be good. They kind of had that Denver first round pick. Yeah, I give up my 25 seconds for Keon Ellis. I don't know if he's exactly what Keon Ellis is exactly what they need, but like that's the type of situation that could probably talk themselves into going a little over the top.
Yeah, if the Knicks had any sort of draft capital left, they'd be the team that I
You
would
don't
say,
like that
like,
fake
go out
Washington
there.
pick?
No, I'm sorry, I don't like that fake Washington pick. I don't feel like, even if they trade for Zion and he's an MVP straight away, I don't feel like that's gonna, translate anytime soon. So I think that that's gonna stay there, and I think that they're gonna struggle to sort of improve the
They're
roster.
another perfect example though, because you would give up that pick. I don't know what seconds they have left they would give up their most recent first round pick in
Yep.
Pacome Dadier. In addition to that, like you would give up that. That's not one you would think about, but I mean, I don't know why the Kings would be interested unless they're really high on like that Wizards pick conveying, but like that would be like that type of team would be able to talk
Yeah.
themselves into giving, okay, they're not high end first round picks, but we've technically given you quote unquote 2 first round picks.
And I think the reason why I wanted to lead with Malik Monk, who you actually led with as well, Dan, is you could feasibly move Malik Monk and you could bring in a player in a position of need with his salary slot, with the other salary on the roster as well. So it's like, we don't have to give up on this straight away. We can try and actually get a power forward. Have you ever heard of a power forward, the Sacramento Kings, in the building, where it's like Keegan Murray doesn't have to be Superman on the defensive end night after night? And we haven't even mentioned Devin Carter's name yet. Made his G League debut a couple of days ago, dropped 29 points, looked phenomenal. So he's another guard that is going to have to find PT for Doug Christie's Sacramento Kings, or, whoever they get in to replace Doug eventually. So something needs to change. The scenery, if anything, is crowded in the backcourt in Sacramento. So let's get away from there and let's talk about another guard that probably needs a move, to my mind. He's a player that, like, I think if you asked fans, analysts, GMs, they would all have wildly differing values on this player. And that's Anthony Simons for me. It feels like his time has sort of come in Portland a little bit. I think if he was going to be this team's true number one or number two, he would have grasped that even in the midst of a rebuild sort of last year, got through plenty of usage, and is now at a stage where that usage is declining. It seems that Shaden Sharp is sort of usurping him on the offensive end, and the shooting percentages have started to drop. Anthony Simons, who's had insane shooting development from the time that he was a rookie, is currently shooting 33% from three this year. And that's not good for a guy that sort of almost exclusively operates behind the arc. So he's someone that I think kind of has to get moved on a team where, kind of like the Sacramento Kings, they need to do some spring cleaning.
Yeah, that's another good pick there. That's because that's a team that's just like, okay, you're questioning the direction here, and yeah, I'm with you on that one. That's one. It's weird that it feels like it hasn't been. He's been talked about approximately forever, but he's never really been like linked to tangible trade rumors. And I think the Blazers are so like they have so little shooting right now that even just the idea of him being a threat, as you said, his percentages are down, but like he's their only off the dribble 3-point threat right now. And in theory, like he's just going to be one of your better floor spacers because defenses actually respect him. But it would be nice to see him settle in to a team where he can either, maybe it's coming off the bench or just being their third option, where he's tasked with maybe less playmaking. And it's just, hey, you need to score, not fully like in the Lou Williams, Jordan Clarkson realm. I actually think that he's more dangerous as an off the dribble perimeter shooter, but like he feels like someone who he can open up the floor for a team that doesn't have a ton of spacing, but he also just fits right into any, like if you already have pretty good spacing, like he'll just elevate that. So he's like this nice blend of plug and play, but also he can create for himself and a little bit for others.
The one team that really doesn't need to trade for Anthony Simons, the Sacramento Kings. So fingers crossed that doesn't happen. But the way that we've been talking about the Kings in recent weeks, I'm not going to rule that out. He was like a trade machine favorite over the summer because he's in this scenario where like they either need to extend his contract, and that extension had like it had a confusing number on it because I think, like I said, dependent on you either view him as like this Jordan Clarkson type, where it's like, oh, he's going to be a six man, he's going to be a bucket getter, and then some people, like in the analytics community, because he's been such a good 3-point shooter over the years, probably have a much higher value on him than that. And it felt like he kind of had to get moved because Portland wasn't ready to really do anything, at least this year. Um, but I think he was kind of linked to Orlando last year. I don't know if that was just, fans looking and going, hey, this is a team that needs 3-point shooting. Anthony Simons, come on down. But he's one of these players that looks really tradable because of the spacing threat, because of the off the dribble 3-point shooting. But then when you have teams that are increasingly committing to an identity on the defensive end, not trying to hide anyone. And if you're hiding anyone, it's going to be your number one offensive player. I think he's becoming a little bit harder to place than the average fanspo user might think. And he's a player that my estimations, he's really sort of like, he rose early on in his career. And now I really don't know what to do with Anthony Simons because I don't really want him running a ton of pick and roll. I would much rather him as that more off-ball threat, maybe like your six-man scorer, almost a Norm Powell type player. But yeah, he's a confusing one. And to me, I fully respect your point about like the spacing and they just need 3-point threat. I would quite like to see him move on, and I'd still like to see Scoot get a chance, even if that seems to be, a bust of a pick at the moment.
Yeah, and also he's only has 1 year left on his deal because, as you mentioned about the extension, and so his trade value already peaked, and they kind of missed the boat on
Yep.
that. And then for him, you probably want him to, if you're him, excuse me, you want to be in a situation where maybe you can contribute to a higher level of basketball to prove your worth in this next contract because you're one of those middle class now free agents or people on deals where if you don't extend with your own team and you head into the open market, it feels like anything could happen. Because I'm not comparing him necessarily to this player, but just look what happened to Malik Beasley over the past 2 years, or Gary Trent Jr. specifically this season. I think Anthony Simons, he's more dynamic than both of those guys. But like, what is he going to get if he goes in the open market and you're coming off from a team where your percentage is slumped? Maybe let's see what he did next year, and the team wasn't good. So how are other teams going to value you? I still love Orlando as a destination for him. By the way, I think people want them to like go after someone who's like bigger and better, but he would be like, if there's like any team. He's also young enough to where if you're rebuilding and you just want the guy in house because you gave up a first round pick or something to get him, and you think that he's just going to streamline the development of others because he is a good floor spacer. You could talk me into, like, I thought about the Lakers for him before the Dennis Schroeder trade with Golden State. Like, he would have been an excellent fit there. You could even like I don't know if he's better. He's probably better than Jalen Green if he used to want to go that route, but you have Jalen Green already. So that's not necessarily a good one. He'd be really fun, the Clippers again, but can you get to that money without including Norman Powell because he makes so much? He fits in a bunch of different spots.
Yeah, he's a fun piston in my book. Like if you want to form like a backcourt trio, Cade, Jaden Ivey, Anthony Simons, and you sort of decide on a night-to-night basis who's going to be starting. If the Toronto Raptors, and I don't think they do this because they've invested so much in Emmanuel quickly, like if they wanted to trade that Bruce Brown contract, they're two contracts that line up pretty synergistically in like a trade scenario that could work out. And I kind of always just want to see players get to the Utah Jazz because I want to see what Will Hardy does with him. Kind of like another player that missed the boat a little bit was Colin Sexton originally, and he's had to go to Utah, rebuild his value, find himself in a slightly different role. And I think that, maybe if Utah moves on from a Colin Sexton, Anthony Simons can just be the next Colin Sexton in Utah, where he gets to have a lot of fun in a really well-spaced system and like set himself up for that contender trade. Because at the moment, like you said, I really like the Lakers name as well. Do they think he's done enough in his career to where they know he can contribute in a playoff setting? It's almost like you might need to put another little bit on your resume before teams go out there and make that sacrifice.
The two other teams that would make sense. So Oklahoma City, I do think either needs, I mean, he can kind of fill both, is a caps lock shooter, like who's going to get them up
Yep.
in volume that they feel like they can play more than Isaiah Joe. And Anthony Simons, he's actually smaller, but he can create some because I do think they kind of need a third secondary ball handler. And
Yep.
so if you don't think that is Aaron Wiggins, and we know that you're not going to get the same level of volume from a Case and Wallace or an Alex Caruso, and Case and Wallace has gotten a lot better this year. He'd be interesting there to where I don't think he would ever close games, and maybe they want to acquire someone who's bigger. Maybe they would prefer Cam Johnson just because he's not as dynamic, but he's bigger, so he's more likely to close games. But if you don't think that Aaron Wiggins or Caruso or Case and Wallace is kind of that solution to giving you someone who can just create from a dead stop, I'll say, in addition to like getting up threes in volume, and they would be a very interesting landing spot for him. And the other team, San Antonio, would be a dream for him, I think, because they need other guys to space the floor. And you just have a defensive infrastructure where between Wemby and Steph Castle right now, and if maybe Jeremy Sohan is going out in that deal, maybe not. Like if you have all those guys in place, like you have the defense to cover up for even with Devin Vassell, who's probably he used to be overrated defensively. Now I feel like he's a little bit underrated.
Yep.
That would be a great setup for them because it's sort of like, well, you're not infringing upon the development of Wemby or Steph Castle, but you're also not going to ask them to handle the ball too much because you have Anthony Simons as another outlet there in addition to Vassell. So that would be, honestly, I think the Spurs would be my favorite destination for him now that I'm talking myself through it.
Yeah, CP3 as well, who can actually get Anthony, kind of similar to how you're speaking about Steph Castle. It's like, no, I can get you the ball when you're operating off ball as well. You don't have to bring it up every single time. And whenever we have these players that you sort of look at and you go, oh, they haven't turned into Trae Young. They're not putting up 20 and 10 each night. They're not averaging insane assist numbers. I always think, can we see you with a big that spaces? Can we see if that like eases your playmaking burden? Maybe it makes it a little bit easier for you to get to the rim. And obviously Vic might turn into the ultimate example of that through his career. So he'd be a really, really fun fit. Dan, have you got another player that you want us to talk about?
I do. And he has, to be fair, he only just recently returned from injury, but he would have been in this discussion anyway, and has been in this discussion for years. And I'm shocked he signed an extension with his team. We got to get Moses Moody off the Golden State Warriors at this point. I actually think this is another situation where they need him. They just don't trust him to play heavy minutes. And every time I watch him, I will say I never come away thinking this guy shouldn't be on the floor. Yes, he's had bad nights. He can be all over the place on both ends of the floor, but this is someone who is a quintessential 3-and-D and a little more wing. And the Warriors are just like, oh, we're going to give you like 15 minutes a night. And I just don't like it. And that's, that might be generous when you're like this season. Okay, sure. But in past seasons as a rookie, 11.7 minutes, as a sophomore, 13 last year, 17.5 this year, 15.9. It's just kind of inexcusable. And he, in theory, shouldn't be eligible for this because of the poison pill. And it's just so tough to move him. Even when you factor in the extension, so he'll count as $5.8 million of outgoing money for Golden State. He counts as $10.9 million of incoming money for what would be his new team. That's a gap that you can absolutely work around. Just get him somewhere that is going to play him. I honestly think if you put him, with the exception of Boston, and honestly, I think that's it. If you put him on any other team other than Boston, he's playing a lot more than he's playing in Golden State right now. And even, fuck it. Excuse me. I don't even know if you're allowed to curse on your podcast. I apologize.
Go for it.
Boston, like, could use a reserve wing. Like, Sam Hauser's been battling the back stuff. Like, he might play more in Boston than he is in Golden State right now. And you explain that to anybody. It's like, it's not going to come off as logical. So, free Moses Moody along with Keon Ellis. Let's go.
Yeah, that poison pill is sort of like, this is why the Detroit Pistons have positioned themselves to be the team that takes back that money. It's not a Jalen Green sized like difference between the outgoing money and the extension. So it's something that you can definitely get round. Yeah, we've been sort of like coached when you're looking at the draft, when you're looking at free agency. It's these 3-and-D wings that can guard at their position, that don't take up a ton of on-ball usage. They're the players that get paid. They're the players that are really scarce around the league. And Golden State has had one for the last couple of years. I'm not going to say that Moses Moody was ready to play in a championship level rotation in his rookie year, but he certainly had enough experience in the league. And whenever he gets a chance to sort of show what he can do on the court, it's not really been disappointing. He's the kind of player that, like you said, he would find playing time on pretty much any team around the league. And I was kind of surprised that he wasn't could he have been an offer sheet guy? No, I'm kind of surprised that he didn't take this all the way to restricted free agency next year. Try and get an offer sheet, try and get out of there. Like, yeah, maybe you take the money because it is life changing, but at the same time, it's just a little bit of a head scratcher in my book.
I wonder if the restricted free agency market plays a role. Whereas, so if you're Jonathan Kuminga and they reportedly offered him $30 million, even if you miss and have a bad year, which he's been all over the place, he's having a good stretch right now. There's probably still someone who will pay you more than mid-level money. But in the case of Moses Moody, you're not playing. And the past 2 summers, I believe, we've seen exactly one restricted free agency offer sheet go out. And that was to Paul Reed, like when Utah did that creative voodoo when the Sixers eventually matched it. So if you're Moses Moody and you're not guaranteed a role, it was probably smart to take the money. I'm not going to lie, but I don't think he should have been in a situation where we were wondering like, oh, is he worth anything? And look, I think Dubs fans, I've seen one of their past 2 games and he's logged over 20 minutes and he's logged over 20 minutes in both of them. I just didn't see the other one. Like, I'm not going to count it as turning a corner until like we string together. Like that needs to be like what, at least 20 games before we say, oh, they're going to use him more. I don't buy it. And I think just honestly, as I said it before, you can put him anywhere. Like maybe the team is because they've been mentioned tangentially to Cam Johnson. You can figure out a way to make the money work with Cam Johnson going to Golden State and then more money going to Brooklyn. And Brooklyn's that team would play the hell out. He'd be running pick and rolls in Brooklyn probably. So let's get it done.
Yeah, let's just see something happen. And another guy that I would say he is in a much better scenario than Moses Moody. He's being used far more. He's actually played like 35 minutes per game over his last 15 for his team, but he's almost like Keegan Murray-esque in, I think he's a player that had a lot of offensive talent coming into the league. I think he was massively misused by the first coaching staff that inherited him. And now he's playing for a winning team, but he seems destined to just sort of fit into this 5th starter role. Dan, what are your thoughts on Jabari Smith Jr.? Because I still hold out hope that this guy could be budget Lauri Markkanen somewhere else. Like if you put him in a role where you ask him to operate off ball, where you ask him to get going towards the rim, you sort of put him in this movement based system where it's not 3 jab steps and like, prime Carmelo Anthony shot diet, but he's someone that I think has been mismanaged throughout his entire NBA career and has still somehow managed to be a really productive player, particularly for Houston this season.
That's an interesting one because I think that the real crux of it is that Houston just has too many guys. And so I don't know that they've improperly developed him so much as the arc of their rosters dictated this is how he's used. But I'm with you on that. Sounds like the optimal role for him on offense. And I think this year, it's little at the beginning of the year. I didn't think he was playing enough 5. I think that's ticked up a little bit. I'm saying that anecdotally based off what I've seen, but like being on a team where maybe he could play, not be the primary 5, but play even more minutes at the center position where that opens up things for him to do as a screener. Cause he's already really good defensively. And I'm not a draft guy. Like I do the crash course leading up to it, but wasn't he billed as like everything was about his shooting coming out of the draft? That's why the Magic kind of wanted him. He's shown some on-ball dynamism to be sure, offensively, but just like the defense has been, I don't know the best way. Like sometimes I feel like we conflate versatility, malleability with effectiveness. In his case, he's malleable and he's really good at it to where like Keldon Johnson is kind of the good barometer here where it's, he'll get moved around defensively or Miles Bridges. Like he'll get moved around defensively. He's not going to be particularly good. Like when he's doing, but like you can move him around. Jabari Smith Jr., you can move him around. He's going to be really good at basically everything. It's just, if I'm the Rockets, I don't want to move him because he's so good. But when you're looking at the trajectory of, well, eventually, don't you want a bigger role for Amen Thompson, who's basically a 0.4, like feels like his long-term trajectory, unless you think that he's going to operate purely off the ball, in which case that would even lend more merit to, he's basically a 4. And then you have Tari Eason here. It feels like Jalen Green needs to go. That's not a change of scenery thing. I just don't think he's what they need. but
Sure.
like they're gonna wind up choosing between Amen, Tari, Jabari, and Alperen Şengün. Like at least one of those guys isn't going to stick, and it feels like Amen Thompson and Alperen Şengün are just going to stick. And so then it comes down to, and they're both extension eligible this summer. Is it Tari or Jabari Smith Jr.? And when you look at what they can do offensively, Tari Eason is clearly not more scalable, but he's more plug and play. Like you don't have to worry about his usage as much as you would Jabari's.
I think that there's just more redundancy having Jabari in that role. And I wonder how like their respective trade values would be perceived around the league. I remember the first time we podcasted together, Dan, it was during the summer, and we spoke about Tari as this player that multiple contending teams could potentially target as like, please, someone go get Tari Eason out of there. But he's so sort of tenacious and aggressive on the defensive end that he's still been able to carve out a really big role in Houston this year. Um, it's more of just it's a fancy of mine. It's a wish that we get to see Jabari in a different scenario. I think I spoke about the Rockets with it might have been with Chuck of the Chuck and Darts podcast, and I just said if only the two Boston assistants could have like joined together and done a joint coaching job. Because if you could have had Will Hardy coaching the offensive side of the ball in Houston, and then you leave Ime to do the defensive stuff, I think we'd be in this perfect position where it's like, Reed is setting the table for everyone. Cam Whitmore's getting played. Jabari's running these routes off the ball. But I wonder how much like coaching time there has been in Houston to where they've implemented this a really aggressive man-to-man defensive system this year. It's really paid dividends. It's still a young roster. Maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit here, and maybe the idea is that next off season, Houston has this big defensive base, and then they're really ready to develop on the offensive end, and they're really ready to add layers of complexity to what they already do. But if not, I think it would just be a real waste if Jabari sort of just stays as that fifth starter, almost in like a Harrison Barnes role that we've seen for the Spurs and the Sacramento Kings in like this late stage.
Yeah, it's just they have Houston's roster. There's just so many directions they're eventually gonna go or could go
Mhm.
rather. And I don't know, like, if I guess you could say the argument against not making this decision ever is just that, well, Dylan Brooks and Fred VanVleet are temporary, and then we're just going to elevate all the young dudes into the lineup, and then Atari Eason is someone who could always come off the bench. But it just feels like even if you went that route, there's always going to be one. I mean, we haven't even mentioned Reed Shepard's name. There's always going to be 1 to 2 guys who are being supremely marginalized, and it just feels like Jabari is guaranteed to be the one or one of the two that gets marginalized
Yes.
because of the position that he plays, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And because of the fact that he's an adequate 3-point shooter, an adequate quarter 3-point shooter, it's just clear. It's just like, go do that, go crash the glass. And then we'll work out how to run Amen Thompson, Alperen Şengün pick and roll. Because at the moment, like that feels a little bit far off to me with their spacing concerns. So it's like you've got so many different things that you need to figure out before it's scaling up Jabari's role. And like you said, Jalen Green needs to move. I look at this Houston roster as they are geared towards a star trade next off season. Jalen, that money comes on the books. You can immediately move him because you've extended him now. Um, and it's just like you said, which piece is going to be attached in there with a Cam Whitmore, with a Reed Shepherd, and some draft picks to go and get a start? Is it going to be Amen Thompson? He feels like the least likely to me at the moment. Is it Tari Eason? Is he like the headline player in a trade? Or is Jabari Smith sort of that perfect Goldilocks zone player where it's like he was a high draft pick, he's come in, and another team sees something that the Rockets perhaps haven't already with him?
Yeah, I'd be curious what you could get. I think you could probably get like the equivalent of 2 first-round picks for him would be my guess. But he's extension eligible after this summer, and the Rockets are just you don't need more picks. So if anything, it feels like they would move him this summer, or would be one of the candidates to be moved this summer as part of that
Mhm.
consolidation trade that everyone wants them to make right now.
If the Kings somehow stay together, he is my perfect player to go to Sacramento. Where it's like, let's say Houston looks and they're like, oh, we could really do with Malik Monk. We're not liking what Jalen Green has given us. Maybe there's like some sort of Malik Monk and a pick for Jabari Smith. You ease that defensive load on Keegan Murray. You sort of skew towards De'Aaron Fox, one of DeMar DeRozan, Keon Ellis, and then Keegan Murray, Jabari Smith next to Sabonis. That actually looks like a 3-4-5 that maybe works. Like we've said, Jabari is already a really handy defender. He's a guy that can operate close to the rim and on the perimeter as well. So that was my dream destination for him, but it just feels like the vibes aren't right either way for that kind of move to happen, particularly at the trade deadline.
I would love that. He would be perhaps the perfect big to play next to Wemby. Maybe perfect's a strong word, but the Spurs would be fun. But that's a team that, okay, you're going after their draft equity at this point, and Houston's not at a draft equity point. And even so, that deal, you like, I think it would probably need another pick, or is Keon Ellis involved in there? But then you look at it and it's, so now what we've done is we've marginalized Reed Shepherd even further in Houston. They just have so many dudes. It's a great problem to have, but it's going to be something. I'm looking at Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore specifically as case studies in. It seems like you're going to bring these guys along super slowly. And even Cam Whitmore, like seeing his role decline year over year to the degree that it has. I'm just interested to see what does that do to, it's not their long-term value, but like what they become long-term. Can it still happen for them in Houston? If they do get moved, can it still happen for them elsewhere? Those are two players I'm going to be watching really closely over the next, 8 months or whatever.
Yeah, Cam in particular really could have made my list because he's a guy that I'm really quite high on. And I think that he's shown, particularly in the G League and like in stretches last year, that he is capable of playing another role. It's sort of like Moses Moody a couple of years ago with Cam Whitmore, right? Where maybe you look at Houston and like we said, too much depth. It's really hard for him to see minutes. But personally, I think he'd be ready to go and take a bigger role somewhere else. Maybe not to that Moses Moody extent. But Dan, have you got anyone else that you want to talk about before we get out of here?
I do have one more that I think needs to be mentioned.
Perfect.
I really think he's played well this year, but even when he's done everything this team theoretically would need from him, scoring, shooting well, rebounding, giving you some defense, it's just not working to me. And that's Benedict Mathurin. Jarris Walker's gotten a lot better recently in Indiana, and we've seen him play a little bit more. Benedict Mathurin's a really good player, but he does not. I guess he tries to play, but he fails a lot of the time. He doesn't play at the cadence, decision make at the cadence that is required of an offense that you want to retain the core of its identity before the Siakam trade. And like, there are going to be points you play slower because Pascal Siakam breaking down defenses in the half court. Like, yeah, absolutely sign me up for it. But they need someone who's going to be more of a natural fit for that catch and go role, and then can toggle between doing the on-ball stuff, slowing things down. And I think, look, I still don't even think he's like the perfect rebounder or defender, but even when he's giving you those boxes, it just still hasn't felt like the greatest fit in Indy. And so now this is someone who is wrapping up year 3, and you have to start thinking about his next deal. It would be cooler to see him on a team that is going to give him the type of offensive agency that I think his skill set not demands, but prefers. But then maybe also is just, okay, you're not third or fourth in the pecking order. Like, you're very much second. And like, let's see, like, if you can break down defenses from there, you're not going to slow us up as much as it seems like he does in Indy. And then also, we're not going to need you to be in some lineups. Andrew Nembhard is kind of your undersized wing when you're looking at the core Pacers lineup, but in reality, like, it's also kind of Benedict Mathurin. Like, let's let him be a 2. Like, and I don't know that Indy has the personnel to let him be really a 2 at either end of the floor. Defensively, maybe, but then like, you're doing that at the cost of size elsewhere. So I think it's probably time for both parties to move on. Again, this is not the way I'm framing it is like, well, Benedict Mathurin is just like, he's failed. And it's no, like, the Pacers have kind of evolved beyond the type of player he is, and he isn't a fit for what's going to be their best style of play on the offensive end. And he's not going to be, whatever you think about him on defense, he's just not going to be a wing checker. And so let's get him on a team that doesn't need that, because then he's probably more valuable to you by, like, if the Pacers just had a wing checker who wasn't Aaron Nesmith or Jarris Walker or Andrew Nembhard, or at least had someone who's better. Like, you have Andrew Nembhard and then, okay, someone who's better than Jarris Walker and Aaron Nesmith. He's probably more valuable to the Pacers than to. And he's now in this weird limbo, which is why I don't think they would move him unless they're taking a mega swing, where he's more valuable to them than he's going to be viewed around the league, because you've let his contract run not so long. Hasn't wrapped up year 3 yet, but you've put him in a situation where, no, he's not part of the problem, but he's not a perfect fit. And so it's the same thing with Jarris Walker, even though he's playing better, is that because neither of them have checked the boxes you need, it's probably diminished their value around the league because they're being looked at through this lens of, well, they didn't do this. And it's, well, guess what? Like, they're not supposed to be doing. Maybe Jarris Walker, when you're looking at the defensive stuff, and he, again, is getting a little better there too. But I would like to kind of see Benedict Mathurin on more of either a team that needs a number 2 or just even more of a traditionally rebuilding team. Like, just throw him in Brooklyn. I know they got Cam Thomas, but that's sort of one example there. I mean, Utah could use some more shot creation aside from the Keontae George and Larry Markkinen of it all. And it's like, is it going to be Isaiah Collier? We know it's not going to be Cody Williams. That looks like that was one of my biggest draft misses of all time at the moment. So that's the type of team I'd like to see him on. But then you get into the dilemma of, well, if you move him, you want players or player, and like, what do these teams have? Like, I guess Brooklyn has a Cam Johnson, but do they want Benedict Mathurin as part of a larger deal? Utah is just, what players do they have that Indy would really want? And they're not going to be a team that trades draft picks. So the type of team that he would kind of be fun on, they need to have a player that then fits like what Indy needs to try to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really wonder what Benedict Mathurin's season would have looked like if Aaron Nesmith didn't get injured at the start of it. Because if you look at his game logs, in the first 4 games, he plays 27 minutes, 23 minutes, 21 minutes, and then 13 minutes against Orlando. And I think that Aaron Nesmith is then healthy for a further 2 games. And ever since then, he has barely played less than 30 minutes per game. Like, there are 2 games where he's played 29 minutes and 57 seconds basically since then. So he's had this massive role as a result of this real sort of like hole at the wing, hole at the 3 that Aaron Nesmith had really filled so well for them last year, when they actually looked like a good vibes team, when they got to the Eastern Conference Finals, when it was all really clicking down in Indiana. And I completely agree with you. It just feels like he's not a bad player. He's not a 0.5 player. And I know that, like, I'm saying that as someone that doesn't necessarily like that term. I don't think it defines a certain style of offense, but he needs a little bit more time on the ball. He needs a big to operate with, potentially. Like, he needs to really develop his pick and roll acumen. And at the moment, he's not good enough to be the offensive star that like Tyrese Halliburton cedes all of his usage to and just says, like, I'll be Steve Nash, you be Kobe Bryant, we're copacetic, we're fine. But he's also not that role player guy that you want to stick in the corner, a la Jabari Smith Jr., Keegan Murray. He's not been marginalized to that degree yet. So he's really a bit sort of like stuck in a halfway house. And I don't necessarily think that it's his fault so far.
No, I'd agree with you. And I think, look, this is probably the closest they're going to come, I would argue, because they have him defending wings less than he did last year, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
But like, is this the best? And I'm honestly asking you this because to me, it feels like this is the best it's ever going to get for Benedict Mathurin on this Pacers team and for the Pacers getting out of him. Like, I don't know that you could have, if you're mapping out a more ideal scenario for the two, it's Benedict Mathurin kind of changing the inherent makeup of his game, that's a really big ask.
Or it's Jarris Walker really emerging as that 3, as that small forward, and Benedict Mathurin just showing himself to be a far superior offensive player to Andrew Nembhard, where it's like, no, we absolutely know that that's our team. And then suddenly we're really big around Tyrese Halliburton because our shooting guard is 6'6". Our small forward is a guy that could potentially switch on to 4s and 5s. But yeah, I completely agree. I think that with the Nesmith injury and with some of the inconsistencies that Indiana's faced so far this year, he's had this real extended run. And while his individual numbers look all right, shooting 37% from 3, 46% from the field, 17 points per game, has upped the rebounding as well, still getting to the line at that rate that had him in Rookie of the Year consideration a couple of seasons ago. It's just not clicked to the degree where you're like, yes, I know that Indiana definitely wants to extend Benedict Mathurin for $20 to $30 million a year when it comes time.
I do have another name. I was actually not going to say him because I was nervous.
No, go.
Because I've kind of ingratiated myself to this fan base because I think I was ahead of their team or understood what they were doing more than other national a-holes like me.
Okay.
And I mentioned him already. If Aaron Wiggins isn't going to play more, like if this is a sub 20 minute per game player, OKC, very little incentive to move him. I want to see that dude in a consistently bigger role. And I want to see, like, we know what he does defensively. We know what he can do in theory as a shooter. We know the rim pressure he provides. I really would like to see a lot of more on-ball reps from him. And I recognize that OKC's depth puts them in a tough spot. But this isn't, I'm not viewing this through an OKC lens. I think Aaron Wiggins has the potential to be like a top 4 to 5 player on a ridiculously good team. And I would like to see him in a larger role. And I don't know if it's going to happen for him in Oklahoma City. And that's not an insult to Oklahoma City. They're just really good. I will say, though, like, they've skewed small, and he's like more wing size than a lot of the players they've been running out. And I get that, like, you know, Case and Wallace and Alex Caruso are better defensively and they can guard up. And I love both of those players. I'm not, if you're going to tell me whose minutes do you want cut in OKC, I'm not going to have a good answer there. So I just don't see, and maybe you, like, because I've thought about this way too much, like, is there, like, does that logic make sense for an Aaron Wade? Like, it's just an embarrassment of riches thing, I guess. So I understand what OKC has done and built, but is there a pathway to Aaron Wiggins ever really branching out, not just functionally, but just in terms of volume to get more minutes consistently in Oklahoma City?
I mean, like, Alex Caruso hasn't necessarily shot the ball incredibly well since arriving to OKC. I know that they've committed to him long term, I think $81 million over the course of the next 4 years. But if Caruso continue to decline, continue to be guarded by fives on the offensive end, maybe you get to a stage where you sort of say, is his defensive output worth it for like the suffering that we're going through on the offensive end, where Wiggins makes a little bit more sense. But they've also got Casey Wallace through the door, who feels like a nice sort of halfway house between these two players, where I don't know if he's shown quite the same level of like defensive acumen as Alex Caruso, but I think there are only 3 or 4 perimeter defenders in the league that have, and he is a really, really good guard defender, Casey Wallace. And he's another one of these players where I wouldn't necessarily want him running pick and roll on my championship contending team, but definitely showed flashes at Kentucky, definitely showed that, you know, he's been able to scale into this really small role where he's mainly been asked to be an off-ball shooter and a guy that makes quick decisions. So if Aaron Wiggins ever does see that rise in volume, he's doing it in a hyper competitive environment. And I think that, Dan, with the contract extension that he signed with, you know, him and Isaiah Joe sort of as these sacrificial lambs who aren't negative salary, who have shown themselves to be really capable NBA players, it feels to me like these are the kinds of players that are going to get sacrificed as OKC continues to sort of like try and scoot around the second apron when they eventually extend a Jalen Williams, a Chet Holmgren, when they try and keep SGA long term as well. And I think that they're going to rely on draft picks to replace the likes of Aaron Wiggins instead of, you know, moving in all the assets to try and get another super duper star in the building. So I think that Aaron Wiggins eventually ends up on another team.
That's a good, you know, I kind of thought of it from the opposite direction of they want to keep this team together. And so, like, you now have Aaron Wiggins locked up for a half decade at less than the mid-level is ever going to be. He's like, whatever, 8% of the salary, whatever it ends up being like throughout the life of his deal. And so it's those guys become more valuable because you don't have to pay them a ton. And so, yeah, but you're right with OKC, like, you're going to get to a point though where you have to pay J-Dub another Shea deal on top of Chet Holmgren. They probably still have like a while before it's a major issue because Isaiah Hartenstein will have that team option as other stuff is kicking in, but it probably goes either way, where it's if they're looking for, I don't want to say expendable salary, but matching salary that's not a core player, the Isaiah Joe and Aaron Wiggins deal certainly fit that mold. I really thought the Alex Caruso injury was probably going to open up playing time for him, and we've kind of just seen it go. I would say like Case and Wallace has seen it up to, and by the way, Case and Wallace is fantastic. Again, if you asked me, how do I get Aaron Wiggins more playing time in Oklahoma City? Whose minutes are you taking? I don't have an answer for you. And I think that's why he might need the change of scenery.
Yeah, and it's definitely an archetype that's going to be valuable around the league. I just can't believe how well oiled that machine is, man. Like, you know, we spoke
you're the
about
Thunder, you don't move
AJ
him.
Mitchell's getting minutes. Yeah, exactly. You move him if it's like that's the area of discrepancy between you and Brooklyn. If you're sure that Cam Johnson is the guy, they're like, no, we absolutely want Aaron Wiggins back in that trade. We don't really care about the draft picks. He's the guy that we want as matching salary. But if not, I definitely think that he survives the trade deadline, and he's probably here, like you said, until they get to those extensions of Jalen Williams, of Chet Holmgren.
I bet you he'll wind up getting. This is what they'll do. They'll split the difference between what both of us is saying is he will be moved kind of in the vein of what you're saying. Like those are the guys that'll get sacrificed, and it'll be for distant first round draft picks. Because if you told
Yeah.
me, like, let's use the Dallas Mavericks as an example, because they can trade their 2030 or 2031 first round pick. I would
Mhm.
absolutely trade that for Aaron Wiggins. And I bet you there's a bunch of Mavericks fans that think I'm fucking crazy, which is fine for saying that. I don't think OKC would accept it either.
Yeah.
Again, if I'm OKC, like I'm sitting on this incredible deal and a really good player, I get it. It's just like that's the tough situation where it's like all these other players, you could kind of see the benefit to moving them. But as you mentioned, like you need to be sure that if you're OKC, like that you even need a type of consolidation or you're looking for a salary type upgrade or it. I guess you're not trading Aaron Wiggins unless you're getting someone who I think you believe if they're not going to potentially crack your closing lineup, like you view them as one of your 6 or 7 most important players on the team.
And at that point, I need to look up Lou Dort's contract. It's like Lou has obviously been an amazing servant in Oklahoma for the past few years, but he's also on moving salary as well. And he is locked up. Oh my, he's locked up till 26, 27, and that's a
He's also
team option as
younger
well.
than everyone might think. It feels like he's been there forever. And I
Yeah.
will say, I think he's kind of become one of the most underrated players in the league because everyone recognizes his defense, but it's just like night in and even with all these other guys on the team, like he still tackles these absurd assignments. And then I know his shooting can be all over the place. I'm a big believer in, and anyone who listens to Hardwood Knocks is probably tired of me saying this. There's value in the volume, and that dude is not afraid. Yeah, he's gonna sometimes take these escape dribble jumpers or these drives to nowhere that you don't necessarily want to see, but there's value in the volume. And where Alex
Mhm.
Caruso and even Case and Wallace can be too passive, you don't have to worry about that with Lou Dort. And so, yeah, that's another salary they could move. But do I want to move Lou Dort to open up minutes for Aaron Wiggins? I'm not doing that.
Exactly, man. And it's just where do you end up settling? I reckon that Aaron probably stays, like we said, for at least the next season or two. And he's just one of these guys that we get to speak about as, oh, if only he could be in this bigger role, if only he had that change of scenery. I think it's interesting the kind of players that we've identified. Like it's either been these players that have been pigeonholed as 3 and D, or they're in a scaled down role because of the talent that they have around them, or it's these not quite good enough to be number one options, therefore you have to sort of scale them down to a 2. They're the players that we're talking about, and I don't know what that necessarily says about the league, but there's been a pretty clear through line throughout this episode where we started with Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson, and we're finishing with the likes of like Jabari Smith Jr. and Aaron Wiggins, Moses Moody as well. There seems to be 2 types of players that in general tend to find their spot, but in these scenarios that we've spoken about, they haven't quite managed it for one reason or another.
Is there a deep cut player that you consider that you just like as a form you wouldn't spend an entire podcast segment talking about?
Yeah, it's Duop Reith. Like Duop Reith has to get on a
My
roster where
God,
he has to
thank
play
you.
somewhere, right? Yeah.
He needs to go. And he was on my list. The other 2, they're Hardwood Knocks favorites. I want to see Cody Martin on a contender because his
Okay.
shooting's all over the place. He can be a good connective passer. He can get going downhill. And I really think he's versatile on defense.
Dan, there's only one place that Cody Martin needs to end up. He needs to end up in the city of brotherly love with his brother, with what's his name, Caleb Martin as well. I think that would finally sort of fix the vibes issue in Philadelphia once and for all.
I mean, maybe, but their defense has been pretty good. I think they probably need someone who's been more consistent offensively. I've been trying to figure out a way to get him to the Knicks, who just need that
Yeah.
kind of other wing type. And he can do additional stuff, but like you can really move him around defensively. And I think if you're gonna
Would you?
go ahead,
Sorry, would you do what? What would it be? It'd be like Nick Richards and Cody Martin for Mitchell Robinson and Nat Fate Washington first.
no, I wouldn't give up both. If Charlotte
Right.
wanted to take a flyer on, like, I'd probably give up. Oh, would I give up the Washington pick for Cody Martin in a vacuum? I don't know. But I wouldn't give up both Mitch and that for the first. I mean, you would have to tell me that Mitch like isn't going to play again until 2026 or something.
So it'd end up being more of like a Precious and Pakame Daddier or Precious and Tyler Kolek.
Yeah, I
I think
think.
that works out.
Yeah, and then in that respect, you're only getting Cody Martin because it won't be enough to get Nick Richards, and I would do that. And then the other guy, and he's been probably one of my longest siren songs, Chris Boucher. I know that the 3-point percentage isn't there. I know he's chaotic on defense and he can't really play the 5. On some teams he might be able to. Anyone who is so committed to closing out and blocking jump shots will forever have a special place in my heart. And it doesn't always end well, but you know that there's going to be entertainment there. And so I still consider him, even though the numbers will not support it. He's like, he's probably a pure 4, but you can get away with some of the 5. And I view him as like a floor spacing defender. And I would like to see him in a larger or at least more consistent role. And Toronto is, as they've gotten a little healthier, like with Kelly Olynyk back, his minutes have again been all over the place. So a team that needs
Uh,
a backup big, I would say, I should be
according
looking at Chris
to
Boucher.
Yeah, according to Raptors Republic and Samson Falk, like the Toronto Raptors have an agenda against Chris Boucher for some reason. I don't know if it's the management staff or like the front office, but they say night after night, Chris Boucher should be playing more minutes, man. Look at what he does on the boards. Look at how he can actually occasionally space from three. Look at the commitment that he brings to a rebuilding team who have currently gone through their worst ever like 3-game stretch. If you look at point differential, it's a dark, dark week for Toronto Raptors fans, unless you're looking at Tankathon. So, yeah, he really feels like a player that doesn't belong on that rebuilding team, where he's more likely to give you 10 really gritty minutes when it matters than like really like elevate a rebuilding team where Jacoby Walter, Grady Dick, and all right Chomche are still trying to find their feet.
Look, we've mentioned Sacramento and he's like kind of a 4. He'd be interesting there. You could play him with Sabonis or use him as your primary backup big, I think. Play him next to Wemby in San Antonio. I will do a podcast of why 29 other teams should trade for Chris Boucher because he's a good fit.
I was going to say we should have a drinking game for every time you say he'd be a good fit next to Victor Wembanyama in San Antonio, because it's gone from Zion Williamson to Chris Boucher and like everyone in between. It's just Wemby is the guy that everyone fits next to. So
Yeah, for
it's
all
like,
the
yeah,
hand
get Chris
wringing
Boucher in there.
over, he needs to get in the paint more. But it's just like the element that he has from the perimeter allows you to play basically any other big
Yeah.
alongside him, which I don't think is something people considered possible when he entered the league.
No, it allows you to play any other big beside him. It allows him to always be back in transition defense, which is great on the other end when you're looking for that foundation. And it allows him to stay a little bit more contact adverse as well, where you're not asking him to play his trade down under, where I'm not even saying like the night after night toll of banging bodies. It's you're reducing your chance of a twisted ankle, of a sprain, of something like that when you're operating 30 feet out, particularly sort of during a regular season where we might already be at the stage where Vic is so good. It's like, let's just nurse the health. Let's keep developing the game from the outside. And maybe when we get to playoff time, play in time, we might see him operate a little bit more inside out. But at the moment, I'm not going to go and tell that guy that he needs to do anything different. Keep playing chess in Washington Square Park.
Yeah. Yeah, I fave that. He's like a maniacal competitor who also seems really fun. And I sometimes feel like you have to almost be one or the other. Not that I think it's probably easier to be really fun and like highly competitive, but these maniacal competitors that get idealized or mythologized, even, they're not like known for being relatable. And he's not the least bit relatable. He's from another planet. He's like 9 feet tall, and yet he just
Yeah.
feels so relatable. So I fave it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when Brian Windhorst went out there and he said, "Oh, what do you do for fun?" He was like, "Sleep." Everyone felt that at a certain point. It's, yeah, we all need to prioritize our sleep. And this 18-year-old 7'4" guy is already ahead of the curve in terms of that maturity. And it just seems like he's building up that ultimate profile of like boyfriends that the dad wants to see walk through the door. It's like, oh, what do you get up to, young man? Like, I play for the San Antonio Spurs. I get up to chess in my spare time. I just focus on my sleep and everything. Really body conscious. I do all my stretches pre-game. He's again like the ultimate good vibes player, and just happens to be playing at like a sub MVP level or beyond, dependent on what you want to call that, like over the last 10, 15 games.
Yeah, I have nothing. I have no notes, nothing to add on Wemby. He's going to be, honestly, he might finish. I wouldn't predict it at this point. He's going to make All NBA, but there's like a chance he's going to finish in the top 5 of MVP voting. And I don't think you can come with arguments against it, but you can't be offended if that happens.
Yeah, I'm really excited to see how that works out come sort of the end of the year. And I think that if the Spurs keep on rolling, and maybe if they rescue one of our players that we spoke about that needs a change of scenery, maybe they push themselves towards a little bit more of a postseason scenario, and that's where we could see Wemby like getting some insane
They,
conversations for a second year player.
they could trade for all of them. They could trade for Duop Reed, Cody Martin, and Chris
Yeah.
Boucher, and that will get them to the 2025 NBA Finals. Probably, I feel pretty confident in saying that.
And Dan, if they do that, I will absolutely have you back on again. Thank you so much for coming on, man. I've had a lot of fun talking about these guys that need a change of scenery. One thing you won't need is a change of scenery from listening to Hardwood Knocks. They put out great content and they've been smashing it day after day through the Christmas period. They got me through my present wrapping, through some like looking around the stores as well. So as you come into your new year, make sure you're listening to them. Dan, what have you got coming up for the loyal listeners?
Like you said, HardwoodKnocks, you got a bunch of content being pumped out there, and thank you for the kind words, most importantly. And you can also check out my work, my musings, my thoughts over at Bleacher Report as well. I have content that goes up there like daily, basically. So check me out over there.
Guys, all links down below. Make sure you go and check out Dan. I'm pretty sure if you're listening to the drop step, you know who Dan Favali is. So absolutely keep up the support there. And keep it locked on the drop step. I've actually got a fair few podcasts lined up before I get back to the classroom. So hopefully some good content going out in the next few days. Thank you for making this one of your first lessons of 2025. Thank you for making it towards the end if you're here. Oh my God. Yeah, we'll see you all next time. Dan, thanks for coming on. Guys, thanks for listening.